Hello, I'm glad you could join me again. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about Laozi and Daoism. But first, a word about spelling. There are two romanization systems for Chinese. So in older books, you may have seen Daoism spelled with a T at the beginning. In newer books, you'll see it with a D. Similarly, Laozi used to be spelled with a TZU at the end, and now it's a ZI at the end. In both cases, the Chinese character hasn't changed, the pronunciation hasn't changed, it's just a different way of rendering that sound into English letters, into the alphabet. So it's Daoism and Laozi. Daoism is the second of the three major native philosophies of China. So Confucianism and legalism are the other two. We'll be talking about legalism in the next lecture. Like so many other early Chinese thinkers, Laozi offers a response to the idealistic, political, family-centered morality of Confucius. In many ways, Confucius established the baseline for later Chinese philosophical debates. Things are sometimes a little more complicated than they seem. Laozi wasn't exactly a founder of a movement, and Daoism is not exactly a philosophical school. The label was given retrospectively to a number of writers who thought along similar lines. I'm not sure that they all would have considered themselves to be Taoists. And Laozi himself, there's a question as to whether he's an actual person. We have a book that was written by somebody, and that book is called the Laozi. Okay, early Chinese books are often named after their authors. But that name, Laozi, literally means the old master. And in fact, Chinese doesn't distinguish singular and plural, so it may mean the old wise ones, the old masters. It was probably not written by a single individual. It's more like Vyasa, remember, the author supposedly of the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. But unlike in India, the Chinese love history, and they've always felt the need to historicize legendary figures by giving them birth dates and genealogies. So here's the story about Laozi, this legendary figure. He supposedly lived about 500 BC, so about the time of Confucius. In fact, Confucius, according to one story, came to him for some advice about ritual and learned from him and then was actually criticized by him as well. Laozi was supposed to have been a curator of the Zhou dynasty archives. After a while, he got tired of life in China, and so he decided that he was going to leave China and go to the West. Whilst he was leaving, there was a guardian of the border pass, the frontier pass, who said, Laozi, don't just leave us with nothing. And so he quickly wrote down this book, the Laozi, gave it to the border guard, and then went out of China riding on the back of a water buffalo. Okay, I don't know about this story, but we have a book. It's called the Laozi. Sometimes it's called the Daoism, the classic of the way and its power. This book is very short. It has maybe 5,000 characters is all. It's divided into 81 chapters, and these chapters are usually just a page or so. It comes out of 4th century BC China from someone, some way. All follow convention in referring to the author of this book, he or she or they, whoever, would just call him Laozi. A modern scholar, Wing-Sit Chan, has said that no one can hope to understand Chinese philosophy, religion, government, art, medicine, or even cooking without a real appreciation of the profound philosophy taught in this little book, the Daoism. I'll try to give you a feel for it today with a number of quotations, but you really ought to read it yourself sometime. It's not that long. When you open up this book, the Laozi, the Daoism, you're obviously in a very different tradition from that of Confucius. Instead of practical, concrete sayings and advice, you find a cryptic, poetic style with proverbs, paradoxes, wordplay, and rhymed passages. So the very first lines are, the way that can be spoken is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. So in Chinese, it's Dao ke Dao, Fei Qiang Dao, Ming ke Ming, Fei Qiang Ming. You can hear it has sort of a lilt to it, and it's easy to memorize. Deeper into the book, you'll find striking imagery. There are lots of contradictions, which may be part of its development as a book of aphorisms. Even we have our own sayings, maybe look before you leap, or he who hesitates is lost. You notice that those have opposite meaning, though you might find them in the same book of Proverbs. But when you read the Tao Te Ching, it seems like it means something, even if it's not exactly clear what that is. In Chinese, there are over 350 commentaries on it, and there are almost that many translations in Western languages. So when I encourage you to read the Tao Te Ching, do so, but you should really read 2 or 3 different translations to get a flavor for how things might be interpreted differently. The translations are quite different. The book is divided into 2 parts. Chapters 1 through 37 focus on the Tao, or the way, while chapters 38 through 81 give particular attention to the. It's an inner strength, often translated as virtue or power, integrity. Tao Te Ching, the classic of the way and power. In 1973, there were 2 versions written on silk that were discovered in a tomb that was dated to 168 BC. In 1993, an even older version written on bamboo slips and dating to before 300 BC was found. There are some minor differences among these versions, but the most immediately apparent is that the order of the 2 major sections is reversed. So that is, in the 2nd century BC manuscripts, they have the power part first and the way part second. So it's the Dao Jing. Okay, we'll just use the standard version. The Tao Te Ching was composed during the Warring States era in China. So this is about 475 to 221. It's after Confucius's death. And like the Confucian Analects, it also offers a solution to the problems of social disorder and violence. But Laozi's advice is not to return to the morality of the past, to those old sage kings. Instead, Laozi argues for a return to the Tao, that is, the way. What exactly is the Tao? Which is kind of a tough question. In chapter 56, there's a warning that those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know. So I'm going to be talking for the next 20-25 minutes. Be forewarned, what I'm saying really isn't the real Tao. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the real Tao. But it seems to have something to do with nature. So let's begin again, and we'll take the quote a little further. The way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. The nameless was the beginning of heaven and earth. The named was the mother of the myriad creatures. Hence always rid yourself of desires in order to observe its secrets, but always allow yourself to have desires in order to observe its manifestations. So it's somehow beyond words. It's ineffable. There's something about mysticism here. You notice there's something about femaleness, the mother of all things, something about desire. There seem to be 2 themes that come out of some of the first chapters in the Tao Te Ching. The first one is the unity of multiplicity. So sometimes the Tao was described as the mother of the world. And the Tao gave birth to 1, which gave birth to 2, and from which came 3, and then the 10,000 things. So the Tao has something to do with the origin of all things. It may be a little like the concept of Brahman in the Upanishads. There's also a theme of the resolution of opposition. Once again, we'll go back to the text. When all under heaven know beauty is beauty, already there is ugliness. When everyone knows goodness, this accounts for badness. Being and non-being give birth to each other, difficult and easy complete each other, long and short form each other, high and the low fulfill each other, tone and voice harmonize with each other, front and back follow each other, it is ever thus. For these reasons the sage dwells in the affairs of non-action, carries out the doctrine without words. What does that mean? I mean, that sounds so different from what we saw in the Confucian Analects. And one way to try to get at that is to ask the question, do you think I'm short? Okay, I am 5'7". And the answer may be, it depends. Compared to the average American male, I'm on the short side. Compared to the average Chinese male, I'm probably more closer to the average. How many things are like that? Well, the answer is, it depends. And the Tao transcends common binary distinctions that we make all the time, right? There's a difference between weak and strong, between hard and soft, light and darkness, useful and useless, right and wrong. All of those are human artificial distinctions, according to Laozi. Right? The Tao doesn't make those kinds of distinctions. It accepts everything as natural. I mean, even say the difference between male and female. And you may be saying, wait a minute, that's a natural distinction, right? But gender is more than anatomy. I mean, perhaps some of you men out there have a feminine side, and vice versa as well. I'm reminded of a cartoon from the New Yorker that plays with the idea of up and down in a Taoist sense. So in this cartoon, there's an elevator operator who's standing in front of an elevator, and up above the elevator, there's a circle with the sort of S in the middle, this symbol of yin and yang. And the caption says, actually, I'm going up and I'm going down. Now, I know that elevators go up and down all the time, but can an elevator go up and down at the same time? And I think the answer is yes. If you were in space, looking, say, on the moon, looking at the Earth through a telescope, and there was an elevator that was right at the South Pole, when that elevator went up with respect to the Earth, it would actually be going down with respect to the moon. Okay. Laozi would love those kinds of contradictions and puzzles. The idea that the universe consists of opposites in harmony can be seen in this notion of yin and yang. Okay. Sometimes Americans say yin and yang. Yin and yang sounds a little more Chinese. So there are these two elements. Yin is dark and passive and female and persevering. And yang is light and active, male, initiating. But they can't be reduced to good and bad. It's not like yang is good and yin is bad, or vice versa. It's more like the opposition between heaven and earth, right? So that both elements are necessary, and everything has some share of both of them. So yin and yang ebb and flow over time, kind of like a pendulum, right? So in the summer, it gets too hot, too much yang, and then it'll swing back the other way to yin of winter, and then it'll swing back the other way. The movement of the Tao, according to the Tao Te Ching, is reversal. So think about all of the artificial human distinctions that we make, right? Gold is valuable, dirt is worthless. But from the perspective of the Tao, those are both natural occurring elements. Well, dirt's not an element, but substances. Even though, from the perspective of people kill each other over the former of gold, and they don't really care so much about the other. Though once again, if you're trying to grow crops, dirt is going to be much more valuable than gold, which is hard to plant seeds in. There's something of a contradiction a little bit here with Laozi, because he says that these distinctions don't matter, like weak or strong, but he actually likes the weak. So Laozi is going to lean toward the unlikely term. In the distinction between solid and empty, he likes empty. He says that it's the doors and the windows that make a room useful, or it's the space in between spokes that make a wheel, or it's the space within a jug that gives it its utility. When he thinks about weak or strong, traditionally, I mean, everybody would say, oh, I like strong better. Laozi is going to say, maybe you should give weak a second look. He says, when alive, human beings are supple and weak. When dead, they're stiff and strong. And then he uses lots of images. He talks about the uncarved block. What shape is that? And it's hard to know before it starts to be cut up. He likes water, which takes the low position. It's submissive. But, he says, nothing under heaven is softer or more yielding than water, but when it attacks things hard and resistant, there's not one of them that can prevail. So water is very soft, and it takes the shape of whatever container you can put your hand right through it, but for wearing down mountains over time, or carving valleys, there's nothing like water. Laozi gives particular attention to women, but he doesn't advocate for equality between the sexes. Rather, the Tao Te Ching celebrates stereotypical female qualities, virtues such as yielding and softness and humility, and it suggests that men would be better off if they adopted those attitudes. Laozi says, know the masculine, but keep to the feminine. Harmony comes from following the Tao. from rejecting man-made distinctions and from hierarchy. So in this case, it's the opposite of Confucianism, which says if everybody knew their place in society and acted in accordance with it, things would work smoothly. Laozi says, just forget all of those social distinctions. They don't matter. Another quote, in the pursuit of learning, according to Laozi, one knows more every day. In the pursuit of the way, one does less every day. One does less and less until one does nothing at all. And when one does nothing at all, there's nothing that is undone. It's always through not meddling that the empire is won. Should you meddle, then you're not equal to the task of winning the empire. Notice that political application at the end. Remember, early Chinese philosophy is often played out before rulers as people are trying to get jobs and give political advice. So in this quote, there's an idea of wu-wei, of non-action, non-intervention, sometimes translated as effortless action. It's not exactly doing nothing, but it's avoiding whatever doesn't come naturally. Don't do things that you have to work too hard at. Do things that are effortless. Laozi is going to give you two cautions here about ordinary ways of doing things. He says, when you emphasize a virtue, you highlight a vice. Or the quotation is, remember from what I read you before, when all under heaven know beauty is beauty, already there is ugliness. Okay, what could that mean? I want you to think of someone who's beautiful. I'll just throw a name. How about Scarlett Johansson? And for those of you who are female, let's say Denzel Washington. When I say that Scarlett Johansson is a beautiful woman, I am also secretly implying that women who don't look like Scarlett are not quite so beautiful, right? You can't define something without showing the other side of it. It's like two sides of a coin. So highlighting a virtue also emphasizes a vice or a deficit. The second caution is the law of unintended consequences, that assertive actions bring their opposites in a sort of a backlash. So if you're pushing too hard at work for a pet project, that can make your colleagues more resistant to it. Or politicians whose ads feature their families a little too prominently make people suspicious about infidelity. Why does he have to go that far? It's like, I think he protests a little bit too much. Both of these ideas, right, this backlash and virtues and vices being inseparable, both of them undercut the Confucian ideas of morality and government activism. Another quote from later on. When the great Tao declined, the doctrines of humanity and righteousness arose, as Run and Yi, which are key Confucian principles. When knowledge and wisdom appeared, there emerged great hypocrisy. When the 6 family relationships are not in harmony, there will be the advocacy of filial piety and deep love to children. When a country is in disorder, there will be praise of loyal ministers. In other words, you wouldn't be talking about filial piety if people were already respecting their parents. I mean, the fact that you're talking about it means there's a problem. Loyal ministers are only praised when disloyalty is common. So Laozi says if you get rid of sageliness and wisdom, benevolence and righteousness, all of those Confucian virtues, the people would be benefited 100-fold. Laozi is going to look back to the era before the Zhou dynasty, to the legendary Yellow Emperor. And he thought of that as a time of when there were small kingdoms and people were content with simple things and few possessions. Toward the end of the Tao Te Ching, he gives his own vision of what an ideal society would be like. He says, even though neighboring states are within sight of each other, even though they can hear the sounds of each other's dogs and chickens, so they're pretty close, their people will grow old and die without ever having visited one another. They're just, that's the end of the quote, but they're just perfectly content with what they have. Okay, let's try some applications here. Based on his understanding of a unified, harmonious cosmos where opposites work together, like yin and yang, Laozi offers several pieces of practical advice to both rulers and individuals. He says, union with nature, right, if you take the perspective of the Tao, that will bring freedom and serenity and longevity. Simplicity and humility are preferable to power and ambition. So you should cut down on your wants, Don't try to be number one. If you try to be number one, number two and number three will all try to gang up and bring you down. He says, how about, he doesn't say, but my paraphrase is, what about being number 9? I mean, nobody will really care about you then. Let the big guys fight it out. Remember, this is a time of a lot of warfare, and you will sit on the sidelines and last a lot longer. Don't work too hard. Quit while you're ahead. Take it easy. Go with the flow. Okay. I grew up in California. This all sounds very familiar to me. You may ask, doesn't talking of simplicity and tranquility, doesn't that all bring its opposite? Remember this sort of backlash thing? If you push too hard, the opposite will come. And the answer is yes. But that's part of his point. The Tao is silent. There aren't any arguments. There's no confrontation. Remember, the way that can be spoken of is not the real way. The best teaching uses no words. Because language is one of the main ways that humans divide nature into this and that and make distinction and assign value to it. The Tao just encompasses everything, non-judgmentally. Since forceful action always brings a backlash, it's best to practice non-action, right? Because civilization is the source of so many problems, government should be as minimal and unobtrusive as possible. Laozi says the worst rulers are despised by their people. Somewhat better are those who are feared by their people. Better yet are rulers who are loved. Okay, and in the West, we might stop there, but Laozi goes further. And the best of all are those rulers who are hardly even noticed by their people. Okay, could this really work? It certainly could work for individuals. When I was living in Taiwan, the first quotation from the Tao Te Ching that I heard was, people said to me, it reminds me of that quotation from Laozi, great wisdom looks like stupidity. Okay, should I be flattered by that or not? There's great wisdom, but there's a looking stupid part as well. But for individuals, you might be able to adopt some of these principles. How about in a larger setting? And I sometimes ask my classes, if we were a Taoist class, how would we do things differently? And they come up with some ideas. We could sit in a circle, right? So there wouldn't be like one person in charge so much. Preferably we'd go outside. That would be good, in accordance with the Tao. No attendance policy, not on a strict schedule. We wouldn't have to get through the syllabus. We could spend time on what we were interested in. There certainly wouldn't be any tests and no grades, because grades are, after all, an artificial distinction. Okay, they're not arbitrary. I try to be very fair. But when I think about what my ideal student is, it would be somebody who comes to me years later and says, Professor Hardy, your class changed my life. Okay, how do I know at the end of a semester who's going to fall into that category? I certainly don't. But so no grades, no tests, not a strict schedule. Would you study in a class like that? Okay, maybe not, but maybe yes as well. Taoism isn't necessarily a philosophy for lazy people. I mean, Taoists can work very hard, but at things that come naturally to them. Okay, I really like my job. I enjoy reading and preparing lectures and teaching. It's actually not work. It just comes sort of naturally, even though I put a lot of time into it. Actually, think about this teaching company course. No grades, no tests. Will you keep listening? Will you apply? Well, sure, if it catches your attention. You might find yourself deeply engaged in this. What about for nations? Could there be like a Taoist country? President Ronald Reagan actually quoted from the Tao Te Ching in his 1988 State of the Union address. He said,
and as an ancient Chinese philosopher, Laozi said, govern a great nation as you would cook a small fish. Do not overdo it.
Okay, perhaps that works. This is the not meddling part. But that may be easier said than done, especially in a country the size of ours. I'm not sure that Laozi would have been thrilled with the lifestyles or the governments of our modern world. Okay, many Chinese have been Taoist in some aspects of their life and then Confucian in others. So this isn't exactly like regular distinction in Western religions. It's hard to be Catholic and Protestant at the same time, or Jewish and Muslim at the same time. But you can certainly be Taoist and Confucian at the same time. The two philosophies, despite their differences, have worked together like yin and yang to enrich Chinese culture. The differences between the two can be summarized as follows. Confucianism is associated with hierarchy, order, social responsibility, conformity, moralism, activism, service, and seriousness. Daoism, on the other hand, prefers the ideals of individualism, freedom, nonconformity, nature, retirement, tranquility, mysticism, and wit. Taoist philosophers are funny in a way that Confucians hardly ever are. Okay, I tried to make those lists kind of balanced because both of those are attractive. I mean, both of those philosophies have their place in life. There are commonalities as well as differences. Taoism and Confucianism are both wary of competition. They're hesitant about direct confrontation. They want to avoid that. And they're suspicious of words being used other than their regular meanings. And they dislike coercion. I mean, they come out of the same historical circumstances, right? Warfare and uncertainty and chaos. And they're looking for social harmony. And they both claim that they've found the way. Later on, when Buddhists arrive in China, they find that they can talk to Taoists. I mean, not just ideas about being and non-being, about the subtle nature of reality and the dangers of desire, but also specific meditative practices. You can imagine Buddhists coming in and saying, we meditate like this. And the Taoists had been doing some meditating as well and said, well, we tend to like this sort of practice of doing it. They have something to talk about. They have a fair amount in common. And in fact, enough was in common that in China, some people said, do you remember when Laozi left China, headed out west? He probably went to India, where he became the Buddha, and which is why these ideas are now coming back to us in Buddhist form. Okay, that's not exactly what happened, but there are these commonalities. Eventually, Taoism became a religion, complete with priests and rituals and scriptures, and Laozi himself was worshipped as a god. One wonders what he would have thought about that. I'm sure he would have been amused. These Taoist ideas get deep into all sorts of things in Chinese culture. So, for example, you have two souls, a yang soul, right, a hun, and a yin soul, po, which matters in ancestor worship because your yang soul, which is light, can sort of go up to the other world, wherever that may be, while your yin soul stays around the grave and then can appreciate the offerings that are made in ancestor worship. Now, I'm trying not to, I'll try to give you a balance on some of these. Taoism may not be universally appealing. For example, Laozi argues against education. I mean, he thinks many people would be happier without education, which gives you desires and then makes you frustrated when you get a degree and then can't find a job. He appears to promote a dangerous sort of irresponsibility, right? Go ahead and quit, he says. Don't work so hard, and there may be circumstances where that's not good advice. And his advocacy of subtle political maneuvering can seem almost Machiavellian. He once said, if you wish to shrink it, be sure to stretch it. If you wish to weaken it, be sure to strengthen it. If you wish to cast it aside, be sure to raise it up. If you wish to take from it, be sure to give to it. Okay, these opposites, what does that mean? Here's an application, perhaps an illustration. Imagine that you have a particularly obnoxious coworker, and you might encourage that coworker to apply for a promotion. You might even write a glowing letter hoping that that person will get promoted to a position that they're entirely incompetent at, and then they'll get fired. Remember, if you want to weaken something, you first strengthen it, or if you want to break it, you stretch it first. Okay. In spite of all of that, Taoism has inspired centuries of magnificent Chinese art and architecture, literature and poetry. I mean, not to mention medicine and cooking, which sometimes mixes things in yin-yang kind of terms. You may have seen these wonderful Chinese landscape paintings, a scroll, and they'll have these magnificent mountains that just tower way above, and then very small at the bottom are some people. It's a nice contrast with Western art that tends to put portraiture, like people, sort of front and center everywhere. But if you think about it, how important in the big scheme of things are human beings really? I mean, from the perspective of the Tao, are human beings all that much more important than, say, microbes, bacteria? Actually, probably bacteria will be around much longer than human beings will be. Okay, one final quotation to end up. When the way is expressed verbally, we say such things as, how bland and tasteless it is. We look for it, but there's not enough to be seen. We listen for it, but there's not enough to be heard. Yet when put to use, it is inexhaustible. Laozi's Tao Te Ching is like that. The book is inexhaustible. It's so clever, so mind-bending, so profound, so confusing. You can read it over and over again and always learn something new, which is what makes the Tao Te Ching a classic and what makes Laozi one of the great minds of the Eastern intellectual tradition. Thanks.